There's a particular kind of silence that only happens after a woman has given everything to a man, and isn't sure he knew what she held. If you've ever lain awake afterward replaying whether he saw you, whether he felt you, whether any of it reached him, whether the man next to you was inside the moment with you or merely passing through it, you're going to understand the 4 things we're about to walk through differently than almost anything you've been told before. By the end, you'll know exactly what real love sounds like in the dark. Not the version men perform in the first 6 months, not the version they rehearse when they want something, but the version only love can produce in a body that has nothing left to hide. And once you've learned to read it, you will never mistake imitation for the real thing again. A woman named Camille came into a session carrying something she couldn't name. 12 years married, 2 children in school. A man who never raised his voice, never forgot a birthday, never asked her to wonder whether he loved her in any way her friends would recognize as a problem. From the outside, every checklist item was checked. They had dinner on weeknights. They had vacations in summer. They had a rhythm that looked from the porch like a life people envied. From the inside, Camille described intimacy like reading a letter from someone standing 3 feet away. The words were present, but the writer wasn't. She didn't have anyone to tell. She didn't have anyone to tell. She didn't, in her words, have anything to point at. She just had the feeling, which by the 8th year had become furniture, the kind you walk around without noticing until guests come, and then you realize it's been the wrong shape for the room for a long time. She wasn't longing for novelty. She wasn't describing abuse. She wasn't describing neglect in any category her mother or her sister would have understood. She was describing something more precise. She was describing the absence of a rival, the feeling that during their most intimate moments, her husband was somewhere else entirely. Polite, capable, present in his limbs, gone in the rest of him. He moved when he was supposed to move. He finished at the right moment. He kissed her afterward. He fell asleep. None of it had ever been a problem she could name out loud, which was exactly why it had become the loneliest geography she knew. Because loneliness you can describe has a doorway. Loneliness you can't describe just becomes the weather. When she tried to explain it, she kept circling the same image. He was technically there. He wasn't actually there. And the distance between those 2 things, the distance between a man whose body is in the room and a man whose awareness is in the room, had become the longest distance inside her marriage. Longer than any business trip. Longer than any deployment her sister-in-law had walked through and come out the other side of. Longer than anything she could have pointed at in a letter to a friend, because the friend would have read the letter and said, "That sounds like a good husband," and Camille would have agreed. And then she would have set the letter down and gone to bed next to him again, and the accents would have resumed its quiet work. What Camille was describing, and the language researchers have used for decades, is the difference between physical intimacy and what attachment theorists call emotional attunement. That invisible calibration between 2 nervous systems where one person's body becomes a continuous signal the other's body can read in real time. Attachment research, going all the way back to John Bowlby in the middle of the last century and continuing through the work of researchers like Sue Johnson and the relational bond frameworks she has spent her career building, has consistently shown that human beings are not merely seeking contact. We are seeking contact in which the other person is genuinely with us, in which their attention, their breath, their pace, their response is being shaped, moment, by what they are receiving from us. Not performance, not choreography. Attunement, the choreography that adjusts itself second by second to the person actually in the bed. So here's the quiet, devastating truth most women don't get told. A man can do everything right and still hand you nothing if during intimacy he is moving through his own script rather than tracking yours. And most women, by the time they're 35, have been in bed with at least one man who knew exactly what to do with his hands and absolutely no idea what to do with her interior weather, with her hesitations, with the parts of her that don't always cooperate with the moment, with the parts of her that sometimes arrive faster than her body did, with the parts of her that on an ordinary Tuesday night with no warning, remember something they had been holding in a back room for years. That is the wound this whole video is built around, not what men do in bed in general. What men do in bed when something real has taken root in them, and how to read the difference, finally, from the inside of your own body, without needing him to tell you, without needing him to perform a version he does not have available. Stay with me, because we are not going to talk about technique. We are not going to talk about performance. We are not going to dignify the advice columns that tell you how to be more attractive or how to dress for the bedroom or how to initiate a certain way. We are going to talk about the 4 behaviors that show up in the body of a man only when something real has taken hold, and how learning to read them precisely changes every choice you make from this point forward. Because the moment you learn to read these 4 behaviors accurately, you stop being available to men who perform love and start becoming available to men who actually carry it. And that single interior shift changes slowly the entire population of men who show up at your door. The first one starts unexpectedly with the hands. She told me about a man named David, a friend of a friend, she said, as if distance made the story easier to tell, as if she needed the small layer of remove before she could speak about him out loud, who had been with his partner for 7 years. 2 miscarriages before the child they'd hoped for, 1 daughter, finally, healthy and loud, and 3. She described the first night they were intimate again after the birth, 6 weeks out, both of them tentative, both of them unsure what was permitted, both of them suddenly strangers in a room they had known by heart before her body changed. She said the thing she remembered wasn't anything he did well. It was the thing he did slowly. He asked before he touched, not in a clinical way, not in a script. He asked the way you ask someone who has just come through something you cannot see, softly, with a pause after the question that left room for an answer that wasn't ready. He asked where her body had changed. He asked what still hurt and what had healed differently than she expected. He asked if she wanted his weight on her or not. He asked 2 or 3 times during the night what felt good, and then he listened to the answer as if the answer was the most important sentence in the room, as if the answer, in its smallness, was the entire reason he had been quiet enough to ask. She cried somewhere around the 3rd question, without being able to explain why. He didn't try to stop the crying. He waited it out with her. He asked again after what she needed. He didn't kiss the tears away. He didn't redirect toward momentum. He let the crying be the sentence the moment had been waiting to say, and then he let the moment continue from there. What David was doing in the framework Brené Brown has spent the last 25 years building around vulnerability, connection, and what she calls daring leadership inside intimate contexts was recognizing that his partner's body had information his assumptions did not. Brown's central thesis that vulnerability is not weakness but the most accurate measurement of courage a human being can produce applies directly here, and it applies with a precision most people miss. Real love does not assume. Real love asks. Because real love understands something men who are passing through never stop to learn. That the cost of guessing wrong in a moment this exposed is far higher than the cost of pausing to listen. And men who have arrived at real love know this without anyone having to explain it to them. They know it the way you know where the stairs are, in the dark, in a house you've lived in for years. What David knew, what his question carried, what his pause after the question demonstrated, was that his partner's body had just done something heroic. Her body had carried a child and lost 2 others, and healed in ways that still surprised her. To walk back into intimacy with that body without asking was, in his internal architecture, a small violence he was not willing to commit. So he asked. He asked because he had already decided somewhere underneath the moment that his certainty about her body was a small thing compared to her actual knowledge of it. And here's what most women completely misread about this entire behavior. A man who asks is not being polite. A man who asks is revealing the architecture of how he sees you. He has somewhere underneath the asking decided not once but continuously in real time that your say matters more than his want in this moment. That is a structural decision, not a stylistic one. That decision does not show up in men who are passing through. It only shows up in men who are staying. Politeness runs out after the third month. Architecture lasts the entire marriage. Stay with me, because we're about to walk through what a man who is staying looks like with his eyes, and it's different from anything the magazines ever taught you how to recognize. It needs to be market behavior. Most women, including women who have read every relationship book on the shelf, have been quietly misreading for decades. Ask yourself tonight, in your last long relationship, and the one before that, and the one you may be quietly tolerating now, how often did he ask before he moved? And how often did he move because stopping would have cost him something? Because asking would have interrupted the momentum he was already building? That single answer in your own quiet arithmetic will tell you more about what was real than every text message he ever sent. It will tell you who was in the room and who was merely visiting it. And if this is starting to land for you, save this for the night you need it most. There is more where this came from, and the next behavior is the one most women have spent years missing without realizing they were missing it. We move now from the hands to the eyes. A client named Mara spent 3 years with a man she described in our second session with the kind of careful precision that told me the word had been rehearsed at home in front of a mirror for a long time. Mostly fine. Mostly Fine showed up on Tuesday nights and noticed when she changed her hair. Mostly Fine initiated and finished and texted afterward and asked about her day. Mostly Fine remembered the names of her coworkers. Mostly Fine brought her coffee on Saturdays, the way her father had once brought her mother coffee on Sundays, with the small audience of a man who wanted credit for the gesture. Mostly Fine did not, in any way she could name, look at her. Not during conversation, not during conflict, not during intimacy. She described the feeling as being in a room with someone who performed care but did not register her. The lights were on, the position was right, the breathing was audible, but the gaze, that ancient involuntary feedback system by which one mammal tells another mammal, I see you, a system older than language, older than marriage, older than any of the rituals we have built to simulate it, never arrived. Mara had a word for it eventually, after about a year of trying. She called it the polite absence. The polite absence is when a man is doing everything right with his body and nothing at all with his attention. The polite absence is the difference, Mara said, between being touched and being visited. And most women, when they first hear this distinction articulated out loud, go quiet in a way that tells me they have known it for years without ever having a name for it. Mara didn't have the vocabulary for it back then when she was still inside the relationship. The vocabulary lives inside the body of work Esther Perel has been quietly building for 2 decades. The body of work that treats erotic intimacy not as a mechanical encounter between bodies, but as a meeting of 2 inner worlds. Perel has written consistently and across multiple books and decades of clinical practice that what makes intimacy alive is not what bodies do, but what happens to the people inside them. The willingness, the risk, the moment when 2 human beings allow themselves to be seen in a register they cannot curate. The encounter, in Perel's framing, is a meeting of 2 inner worlds. The tragedy is not that the bodies fail to meet. The tragedy is that the inner worlds never come into the room, that one of the 2 people presents the body but not the self, and the other person is left alone with the body of someone who isn't quite there, holding a hand that isn't reaching back. When a man loves you for real, his eyes will betray him in the most specific way. They will land on you during intimacy with a quality that has nothing to do with attraction and everything to do with attention. There is a softening that cannot be staged. There is a steadiness that cannot be performed. There is a kind of watching that looks, if you're paying close attention, like the difference between someone watching a screen and someone watching a child sleep. Except in this case, what he is watching is not passive, not distant, not removed. He is watching because he cannot look anywhere else. Something in you has caught something in him, and his eyes have stopped auditioning. The gaze of a man in love has weight. It has duration. It has, if you let yourself notice it, an almost unbearable quality of patience, as if the man is not trying to consume the moment, but is trying every second to be inside it with you. You can feel it on your skin without his hands moving. You can feel it across a dark room when he is 20 feet away. You can't feel it the morning after, when he is still looking at you the same way he did in the dark, because nothing in you in the morning light has become less to him than it was at midnight. This is the part the advice columns and the podcasts and the dating apps never reach, because none of them can teach a man how to do this. None of them can manufacture it for a man who does not carry the underlying wiring. The softening in his eyes comes from a system the man does not fully control, and that system lights up in fMRI studies of secure attachment, the same system John Gottman's 4-decade research program at the Seattle Love Lab has mapped again and again as the foundation of what he calls the emotional bid, the small continuous offering a partner makes when they turn toward you with their attention. Gottman's body of work, not a popular phrase, a research corpus spanning thousands of couples and decades of longitudinal data, has shown consistently that what separates relationships that thrive from relationships that fail is not the absence of conflict. It is the presence of bids being seen, made, receive, turned toward. Intimacy is the most concentrated emotional bid a couple ever makes of one another. A man who loves you turns his whole body toward you when you are most exposed, not just his eyes, his breath, his orientation, his whole architecture of attention. A man who does not love you cannot fake this for very long. Eventually, the script takes over. The eyes look away. The eyes go flat. The eyes find somewhere else. The ceiling, the window, the inside of his own interior monologue, the imaginary grocery list he is already composing for the morning. And the woman on the receiving end of that gaze learns slowly over many years that being watched and being seen are entirely different experiences, and that the second one never arrived, and that the children she may have had inside that relationship arrived into a household where being seen was already a quiet inheritance they would have to learn, slowly, to unlearn. What to do tonight if this opens a door you had quietly shut. Stop asking yourself whether he found you attractive. That question is too small for what you're actually trying to measure. Start noticing whether he found you, whether he was inside the moment with you, whether his gaze during the moment you were most genuinely yourself had weight you could feel, weight you could stay under, weight you didn't have to manufacture with another person the next time you were lonely. There's a gulf between attractive and found that most women have spent decades confused in, and most women have made entire life decisions based on a reading that mistook one for the other. The second behavior ends here. The third one lives in his breathing, and this is the one that has, in my experience, the lowest survival rate among men who are simply passing through. She was 36 when she told me about it. Hannah, married 8 years to a man she described almost apologetically as decent in every room of the house except the one we shared at night. Decent at school pickup. Decent at her mother's birthday. Decent at her mother's birthday. Decent when the dog was sick. Decent in crisis. A man who called the plumber and waited for him and paid him fairly and tipped him too much. And then, behind the closed door, somehow, somewhere else. She said the moment she could always clock was the pause after. There is a moment every couple who has been intimate for long enough knows, the moment when the act itself is over and the question of what happens next becomes the entire moral landscape of the relationship. Does he reach for you? Does he fall instantly asleep? Does he get up and walk to the kitchen for water he doesn't need? Does he check his phone? Does he stay? Does he, in some way the body can read, continue to be in the room with you? Or has the room, as far as his nervous system is concerned, already ended? Hannah's husband did the last thing. He stayed, but his breathing changed. She described it with the precision of a woman who had been listening for years for any sign that she was still in the room with him. She described it as the breath of a man who had set down a weight, the breath of a man who was somewhere else inside his own body, whose attention had quietly left the bed and returned to his own private weather. He was still warm. He was still touching her shoulder with one arm. He was still technically present. The breath had changed, and the breath had taken everything with it. The conversation that should have started, the softening that should have arrived, the moment of mutual visibility that should have followed, two bodies doing what two bodies had just done. For weeks, Hannah assumed it was her. Then she assumed it was him. Then she assumed it was marriage itself. The universal exhaustion she had read about in women's magazines and heard her sister-in-law joke about at brunch, the joke disguised as wisdom. The first 5 years are for him, the next 5 are for the kids, the rest are for the dog. She did not, for almost a year, consider the third possibility, that she was sleeping next to a man who had not made a single decision ever to remain emotionally present after the act, and whose nervous system was now politely clocking out as soon as his body had finished what his body came to do. Because polite clocking out was, in his interior architecture, the default. He did not choose it. He had never chosen anything else. He did not know there was anything else to choose. What Hannah was naming in the language the clinical researcher Dr. Ramani Durvasula has built her public work around, the body of work on narcissistic patterns, emotional unavailability, and the architecture of disengagement that has emerged from her long clinical career and her writing for general audiences, is the absence of what she, building on a much older clinical tradition in psychology, calls sustained engagement. Sustained engagement is the post-intimacy window, where the body's bonding chemistry is still flooded, where attunement should be easiest, where the man's attention should still be shaped by what is happening to the woman next to him. It is the window where a man who is genuinely available stays accessible rather than withdrawing into the neutral of his own interior life. It is also the window where a man who is emotionally unavailable, with great gentleness and almost no cruelty, simply leaves without ever getting out of bed. The neurochemistry, even when we keep it general and don't claim more than the research has earned, supports the distinction. The post-intimacy window, as described in the wider body of work on oxytocin and dopamine regulation and the bonding systems that researchers have studied across mammals, is a physiological opening. The brain's reward and bonding systems are literally more available to connection in the minutes after the act than at almost any other time during the day. A man who is in love shows up in that window, not because someone taught him to, not because a podcast told him to, because his attachment system in that window simply cannot do otherwise. He stays in the continuing conversation of the moment. He touches her arm absent-mindedly. He says something small that has nothing to do with what just happened, a sentence whose smallness is its entire point, because the sentence is not a performance. It is the sound of a man who is still in the room. He asks how she's feeling, and he waits for the answer in a way that lets her tell the truth. He puts his hand on her stomach and lets the silence afterward be a continuing thing between them, not a closing one. A man who is not in love either disappears entirely, physical, emotional, both, or he stays physically while his nervous system leaves. The quality of his breathing is the unfakeable tell. You've been lying next to that tell for years in some cases, and you already know in your body exactly which man you've been with. You already know what it felt like when his breath stayed in the room. You already know what it felt like when his breath left, and how every time it left, a small part of your body quietly decided, without your permission, that it was not coming back. And you kept going anyway because the alternative required a vocabulary you had not been taught. Stay with me, because the fourth behavior is the one that most clearly reveals whether a man can hold the version of you he didn't prepare for. And it is the behavior you cannot unsee once you have seen it. What to do tonight with everything this is opening? Notice in the quiet of wherever you are, the men you have loved, and ask a quieter question than you have been asking. Not did they perform, did they remain? Because that one word, remain, separates with surgical precision the lover from the visitor. The visitor arrives on time, does the thing the moment requires, and goes home inside himself before the pillows have cooled. The lover arrives, does the thing, and stays in the room with you after. The lover does not treat the moment after the moment as administrative. The lover treats it as the moment itself, as the moment where the relationship finally becomes visible, because both people finally have nowhere to go. And here is what reorders the entire frame, if you'll let it. We have been taught as women for most of our lives that real love shows up before intimacy. That love is in the chase, in the courtship, in the choreography of being pursued. We have been taught that what happens after the act is a kind of footnote, a small mechanical thing the relationship needs to clean up before the alarm goes off. But everything we have been walking through here, the asking before the hands move, the gaze that lands with weight, the breath that remains in the room, all of it happens either during or after. Real love is not proven in the minutes leading up. Real love is proven in the minutes that follow, when the man has no story left to tell himself, no chemistry left to ride, no momentum left to carry him. That is when the only thing still operating in his body is the quiet decision to remain close. Everything you thought you were evaluating, his chemistry, his performance, his confidence, his attention to physical detail, was a warm-up act. The actual test was always in the silence afterward. If he stayed in that silence with you, you were being held by something real. If he did not, you were loved by something temporary, and the rest of your life with him, no matter how long that life lasts in calendar years, will be a long, slow, private negotiation with that absence. You will spend years in a relationship with someone who, in the most important window of the night, was somewhere else, and you will keep reaching toward the somewhere else without ever reaching it. Take that with you tonight, not as bitterness, not as blame, but as information. Information you will not have to unlearn. Information you can carry, finally, into the next room you walk into with a man, and information that will let you read, in his breath alone, whether he is staying or whether he has already left. The fourth behavior lies in how he treats you when something unplanned happens. When the script the man prepared for breaks open and the actual you, the one not briefed in advance, walks into the room with no warning and no choreography and no way to be smoothed back into the version of you he had been ready for. She came in one Tuesday morning and said the matter-of-fact sentence that took the room 3 seconds to absorb before anyone said anything back. A woman named Tess, mid-career, mid-30s. She had been with Mark 4 years. Mark was, by every external measure she could name, an exceptional partner. Mark planned things. Mark listened at dinner. Mark was tender in ways her own father had never been. Mark had repaired, in some quiet way she had not expected, several of the smaller wounds she had brought into the relationship. The wound of being talked over in her childhood home. The wound of being asked, growing up, what was wrong with her, instead of being asked what had happened to her. Mark had begun to repair these things without being asked to repair them, which was the most surprising thing about him. And then she described the night everything she thought she understood about him came into question. They had been intimate, a long, slow thing on a Sunday night, both of them unrushed for once, both of them without anywhere to be the next morning, both of them arriving at the moment in the unhurried way that unhurried couples learn to arrive at the moment after several years together. Somewhere in the middle of it, Tess had cried. Not from sadness, not from pain, from a place she could not, even now, fully explain. Her body sometimes did this. Released pressure it had been quietly holding for years during moments when the armor finally came down. She had cried, and then she had apologized, the way women have been trained to apologize when their full self arrives without permission. And then she had waited, the way women wait, to see what he would do with what had just happened. Mark froze. She said it took him maybe 4 seconds and that she counted them the way a person counts seconds in an emergency. In those 4 seconds, Tess said, she watched the entire architecture of their intimacy rearrange. He did not freeze with cruelty. He froze with the kind of confusion a person shows when handed something they were not briefed on, when the version of the moment the man had been preparing for was suddenly replaced by something he had no map for. He froze because he had no map in that moment for a partner crying without warning. He had no map for vulnerability she had not asked permission for. He had no map for the fact that intimacy in her body sometimes opened rooms she was not planning to enter, rooms she had not even known the door to until her body opened it for her in the middle of the night in front of him. And then he recovered. He said something kind. He held her. He did, by every checklist, the right next thing. He brought her water. He asked her, gently, whether she wanted to keep going or whether she wanted him just to hold her. And then he let her decide. He did, by every action visible to the outside world, the right thing. But the freeze had already happened, and Tess could not unfeel it. The freeze had told her in the only language her nervous system trusted that he had been preparing for a version of her, and that the version of her he was preparing for was not her. And once a woman learns that the man she loves has been preparing for a version of her, the knowledge does not leave. It just waits patiently for the next Sunday night and the next. What Tess had stumbled into is something the body of work on secure attachment. The attachment lineage that runs through Mary Main's decades of research at Berkeley, the modern relational research traditions, and the framework John Gottman's team has built around rupture and repair, describe with devastating consistency. Rupture and repair, the understanding that intimate bonds are not built by never breaking, but by how a person moves through the breaking when it occurs, including, especially, in the middle of intimacy, is foundational in modern relational research. Gottman's research program has documented again and again across thousands of couples that the way a partner handles rupture in the first 90 seconds predicts the trajectory of the relationship more reliably than almost any other variable they have measured. Not what the partner says the next morning, not the apology delivered over coffee the next day, not the conversation a couple has in the bright kitchen sunlight on Monday. What the partner's face, breath, eyes, and body do in those first 90 seconds when something the partner did not plan suddenly walks through the door. A man who loves you for real does not freeze when you become unexpectedly real. He stays with you. He lets the unexpected have a place in the moment. He does not treat your tears as a problem to be solved in the next 30 seconds so the script can resume. He does not try with great kindness to repair the rupture before he has actually understood what the rupture was. He treats your tears as information that you, in this most protected moment, trusted him enough to stop performing. And he honors the trust by staying curious instead of retreating into competence. He leans in. His eyes soften further, not less. His hand finds your face or your shoulder with a question in it. His breathing slows instead of shallowing. He does not make the moment smaller than it is. A man who is not in love, even a kind man, even a man with good intentions, even a man who will recover well in the next 10 minutes and will say tender things in the next hour, treats your unexpected emotion as a disruption to be managed. He fixes it. He tries to make the moment feel like the version of the moment he had prepared for. He will likely do this with enormous tenderness. He will likely do this without any cruelty. He will likely do this, in many cases, because he has read the same books about supportive partners that you have read. And in trying, he tells you, almost always without words, that he had been preparing for a version of you and not the actual you, and that the actual you, the one who surprised him, has quietly been added to the list of things he cannot handle in real time, the list of things that live in his interior, on the other side of a door he will someday close when the surprise becomes too frequent. This is the behavior you can almost never recover from once you have seen it, because it tells you in a single 4-second window whether the man has built the interior architecture to hold the version of you he did not prepare for. And most of the men you have ever loved have not. Most of the men you have ever loved were prepared with great care for a version of you. The version of you that cooperated. The version of you that arrived on schedule. The version of you that did not, in the middle of an ordinary Sunday night, suddenly become a human being with rooms inside her that nobody had ever been briefed about. What to do when the next moment arrives in your life. And it will arrive, not as a dramatic moment, but as a small, quiet one. The sigh you didn't mean to let out, the laugh that turned into something heavier, the pause that went one beat too long, the sentence you started and couldn't finish. Watch his face in the first 4 seconds. You will see in those 4 seconds the architecture of how he loves. And if the architecture cannot hold something you did not plan, the architecture cannot hold the rest of your life either. That is the cleanest sentence I can give you tonight. That is the heart of it. 4 behaviors. Questions spoken before the hands move. A gaze that lands on you and not on the body you happen to be inside. A breath that remains in the room after the moment the body is finished. A face that does not flinch, freeze, or fix in the 4 seconds after you become more human than he prepared for. None of these behaviors are techniques. None of them can be performed for long. All of them live in systems, in attachment, in oxytocin regulation, in the secure versus anxious architecture the man brought into the room long before you did. And you cannot fake any of these systems into him from the outside. You cannot coach them in over a long weekend. You cannot train them in with a book. You can only read what is already there in his body and decide finally whether what is already there is enough. So why does any of this matter tonight? For you, listening in the quiet of wherever you are. Because most women have spent years learning the wrong alphabet. We learned to read what he said. The words, the promises, the Sunday night reassurances after the Saturday night conflict, the long explanations he gave in the morning after the silence of the night before. We learned to read how often he said those things, how confidently he initiated, how well he performed certain gestures other men had failed to perform before him. We learned to read the surface of intimacy because the surface was teachable and visible and let us compare one relationship to the next, letting us rank, like shoppers in a market, the men who passed through our lives by how well they performed in the parts of the script we had been taught to monitor. We did not learn to read what his nervous system was doing during the 4 seconds we did not expect. We did not learn to read the difference between a gaze that lands on us and a gaze that lands on the version of us the man was hoping to find there that night. We did not learn to read the difference between a man whose breath stayed in the room and a man who politely clocked out of the breath the moment his body was done. We did not learn to read the 4-second window that reveals whether the man beside us has the interior architecture to hold the version of us we did not plan to be. We were never taught the alphabet that matters. We were taught the alphabet that lets us be fooled, and most of the men we have loved know that alphabet by heart. They have studied it. They have rehearsed it in the early months of every relationship. They know the words, the gestures, the timing of the texts. They know exactly how to ask in the early days whether we are okay. They know exactly how to look in the early weeks as if they are seeing us. They know exactly how to stay in the early months in the breath after the moment. They know all of it. They know most of it better than we do because most of them learned it, consciously or not, from men who came before them. And then somewhere in the 2nd or 3rd year, the rehearsal ends, the alphabet changes, and what remains is what was always going to remain, which is finally who they actually are. And the cost of that, the cost of years spent reading the wrong alphabet, is that many women have walked away from real love because they could not see it. They mistook the anatomy of real love for the absence of passion they had been told to look for. They left a man whose breath stayed in the room because the room didn't feel electric enough, because the electricity was always a performance in the men who came next, and because they had begun to confuse performance with proof. They will spend years, sometimes decades, looking for the electric version of a man, and they will never find it inside any man who is actually in love with them, because real love does not run on electricity. Real love runs on a quieter current, the one that lights up only in the body of a man who has stopped rehearsing. And many women in the opposite motion have stayed inside temporary love because they mistook its performance for its substance. They have stayed inside relationships that gave them the alphabet they had been trained to read while quietly, every night, the nervous system under their skin was telling them a language they had never been taught to translate. They have stayed inside marriages where the man performed the alphabet perfectly in the early years and then slowly stopped performing it altogether, leaving them alone with a vocabulary of gestures that no longer meant anything. They have stayed inside relationships where they kept reading the old alphabet even after the man had stopped writing in it, hoping that maybe, with the right reading, the gestures would eventually mean something again. They don't. That ends here. Not because bitterness serves you, because clarity serves you. Because you deserve a vocabulary that lets you read what is actually happening in the body of the man you are with in a register that does not require his honesty to function. Because the alphabet of real love is written in the body, not on the page. And once you have learned to read it, you cannot be talked out of what you have seen. Here's the thing we have not put in plain enough language yet. A man who is genuinely, structurally, neurologically in love with you will be readable, finally in your own body, not in his words, his text, his promises, his calendar, his apology tour of last weekend, his performance of being a good partner at the dinner with your sister, in your body, the way your shoulders drop 3 minutes after when he has stayed, the way your breath unclenches when his eyes land on you with weight instead of appetite, the way your jaw releases the next morning when, instead of reaching for his phone, he asks how you are, the way your stomach softens instead of tightening when his hand finds the place on your back he's been finding for years, because his hand has remembered again where the place is, and the remembering is not a performance. The way your body finally lets go of the bracing it has been doing for years. The bracing you didn't even know you were doing until the morning you woke up next to him and realized for the first time in a long time you hadn't been bracing. Your body will know before your mind has organized the explanation it will then attempt to defend, whether the man touching you was touching you from love or from habit. The body has never once lied about this. The body has never lied about a man in your bed in your entire life. The body has, in fact, been keeping a meticulous record. Your mind has spent years translating the body's signal into a story it could defend. He's just tired. He's been stressed. He's like this with everyone. It's not personal. I shouldn't make it about me. I'm probably overreacting. Every couple goes through this. My expectations are too high. My mother didn't prepare me for this. And the body has been right every single time about what was happening. The transmission from his nervousness to yours has been clear. The story your mind wrote on top of it has been the only thing standing between you and a truth you were not ready to act on. The mind's job in those years was to keep you in the room. The body's job was to keep telling you why you shouldn't have been, what to do tonight in the quiet hour before the rest of the night asks anything else of you. Close your eyes for 1 full minute. Don't go to the worst thing he did. Don't go to the longest silence he ever gave you. Go to the smallest moment of real love you can remember, the moment that almost didn't make it into the story because it was so small. And stay there. Notice very carefully what your body does when you return there. Notice whether it relaxes or contracts. Notice whether it opens or closes. Notice whether the breath in your chest loosens or tightens. Notice where your shoulders go. Notice what happens to your jaw. That answer, not his performance, not his words, not his calendar, not his apology tour. That answer has always been true. That answer has been your only reading instrument all along. That answer is not subject to his revision. That answer is not subject to his rewrite of last weekend. And the moment you trust it, the alphabet begins to read itself. Now, here's what we have to say before we close. Because if you walk away from tonight's conversation still reading the wrong alphabet, none of this matters. There is a quiet recalibration that happens inside a woman once she finally learns this alphabet. It does not happen loudly. It does not happen in a single dramatic night. It does not announce itself with a confrontation or a goodbye or a fresh start in a new city with a fresh haircut. It happens over months. It happens in the way she stops choosing from desire, which almost always means choosing from performance. It happens in the way she stops choosing from chemistry, which almost always means choosing from rehearsal. It happens in the way she begins choosing from a quieter place, the place where her body already knows before her mind has constructed a story about it, whether the man in front of her is in the room or merely passing through. And once she begins choosing from that quieter place, she starts to feel, sometimes for the first time in her adult life, how loud the room she's been standing in actually was, how much static she'd been filtering out, how much performance she'd been rewarding. And that recalibration over time does more than change who she chooses. It changes who shows up to choose her. Because a woman whose nervous system has been calibrated by the alphabet of real love stops broadcasting the signal that asks for performance. She stops rewarding in her body what every passing through man in her life has been trying to sell her. She stops responding to the rehearsed gaze, the rehearsed question, the rehearsed breath in the minutes after the moment. She becomes harder to fool, not because she has built walls, not because she has become cold, not because she has given up on the possibility of being met, but because her body has learned the alphabet, and the alphabet, once learned, cannot be unlearned. It operates below the level of decision. It operates in the breath after the moment, in the way her shoulders drop when the man beside her stays. It operates in the 4-second window where, if the man's face flattens, her body registers it before her mind has time to begin its usual translations. It operates from that point forward as a kind of permanent recalibration she carries into every bedroom she will ever enter again, and into every relationship, every marriage, every quiet Tuesday night that asks her to trust or not to trust the man beside her. So if you have been confused for years, if you have been wondering whether what you felt was insight or wish, whether the ache in your chest during the long paused silences after intimacy was intuition or injury, whether you were right to keep wanting a thing you could not name, I want to offer you a frame you can carry, a quiet sentence to put in your pocket, one you can pull out when the next man stands next to you in a doorway and you can't decide if he's in the room or not. The ache was almost always information. The body was almost always telling you the truth. The mind was almost always constructing a story the man had handed you, because the story he handed you was easier to live inside than what your body was telling you, sentence after sentence, all along. You have not been wrong about what you felt. You have not been imagining it. You have not, as some part of you has wondered in the long, quiet nights, been too much or too needy or too awake for what was actually happening. You've been reading the alphabet correctly every single time. You have simply been translating it over and over into a vocabulary that allowed you to stay. And that vocabulary was never serving you. It was serving the man in the room who needed you to translate it that way. So he didn't have to look at what was actually happening on his side of the bed. So he didn't have to ask himself, in the 4 seconds after your face became more human than he prepared for, whether he had built the architecture to hold the version of you that was arriving without warning. That ends here. Not because staying was wrong, because you deserve a vocabulary that lets you read accurately. And because the next time you will not have to guess. The next time, the 4 behaviors will land on your nervous system, and your body will give you its answer first, before your mind has time to write the story it has been trained to write. The next time, you will know in your breath, in your shoulders, in the way your jaw releases or doesn't, whether the man beside you was inside the moment with you or merely visiting it, and you will not need him to confirm it. You will not need him to explain it. You will, at last, be able to trust the only reading instrument that has never once been wrong. And if this conversation found you tonight at the right moment, I put together one more piece for you about what actually shifts inside a man the moment you stop waiting to be chosen and begin, quietly, choosing yourself. That one is for the woman on the other side of this alphabet, the woman whose body has finally learned the language, the woman who is no longer available to performance, the woman whose nervous system has been recalibrated by everything we have walked through here, and who is ready to find out, finally, what it feels like to be the woman who stays in her own room first. Save it for the night you most need it. I'll meet you there.